Yes,
Yeah,
no, that's right. We started off with the idea that people with diabetes base their diets on a carbohydrate exchange, so that they can exchange foods which contain 15 grams of carbohydrate, for example. So 15 grams of carbohydrate from bread, or from lentils, or from rice, or from apples, and they would all be considered the same. When we started measuring the glycemic responses, we found they were not the same when you give people the same amount of carbohydrate. So the glycemic response is simply the amount that the blood sugar rises, or the blood glucose rises, after you eat something. There's a lot of different ways you can measure the glucose response, and it depends on it's different in different people, it's affected by the food, and it's affected by a lot of things. For the glycemic index, we tried to standardize, we've standardized the methods so that we're trying to control all of the factors. And what we do is we take the glucose response elicited by a food, 50 grams of carbohydrate, and we compare that to 50 grams of glucose. And so if a food has a GI of 50, that means for every gram of carbohydrate in that food, it gives you half of the glucose response, 50% of that for glucose. And so what the GI is, it's a property of a food. We're trying to measure a property of a food in people. So it's got nothing to do with the person's glucose response. So a person with diabetes might have 10 times the glycemic response of a person without diabetes, but pasta, for example, which has got a GI of 50, is still going to have a GI of 50 in the person with diabetes as it does in a normal person. Now, the glycemic load was developed by scientists at Harvard to try to take into account the amount of carbohydrate as well. So glycemic index is the same for one piece of bread or a whole loaf of bread. It's independent of how much carbohydrate. So that doesn't tell you the glycemic response. So what the glycemic load is you multiply the glycemic index times the amount of carbohydrate, and that gives you the glycemic load, which is trying to tell you both, it takes into account both the amount and the source of the carbohydrate. So, well, that's sort of the definition in a brief way. A lot of research shows that many of the complications of diabetes, and in fact even people without diabetes, the higher the glucose response, the more risk they have of developing cancer or cardiovascular disease. If you don't have diabetes, if you have a high glucose response, you're more at risk for developing diabetes. For GI, this is a way you can choose foods which give you a lower glucose response for the same amount of carbohydrate. We certainly believe that it's good to have a diet which contains a relatively high amount of carbohydrate, for example, say 50% of energy from carbohydrate. So the question for us is not so much how much carbohydrate, but what kind of carbohydrate are you going to choose? Which foods? Is it better to have pasta for dinner or to have bread for dinner? And so if the pasta had a lower GI, we would say it would be better to have a lower GI choice. And in fact, the research shows that is beneficial for people.